Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I'm Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I'm smiling ear to ear because we're back again for the third part of our organizational and individual vicarious trauma webinar series. And, for those of you who have been with us since part one and part two, I know you're just as excited as I am, and I'm glad that you're here and glad that you've stayed with us throughout this journey. And for anyone who's joining us new, welcome. If you need the previous recordings, you can always reach out to me. We're happy to have you, and I'm happy to be in this space and learn with you all. So, housekeeping announcements, as always, the boring stuff. This is being recorded, and a copy of this recording will be sent to all of you who have registered. If you have to hop off early, we know you're busy. We know you have fires to put out. That's why we're here. You can still get a copy of the recording. You'll automatically get it by registering, so don't worry. I am going to put my email into the chat. If you have any questions or worry about getting that recording, you can always email me. Second piece of housekeeping announcements is this entire webinar series has been approved for CLE credits. We love our CLE credits. However, the Florida Bar does ask that I don't provide the CLE code until the end of the final session, because overall the series was given CLE credit, and that's 5 general CLE credits. So all that mumbo jumbo to say, I will not be providing the CLE code at the end of this webinar, but part 4, which is next Wednesday, is when I will be providing that CLE code. So join us. Other housekeeping announcement, questions and answers. We love to hear from you. I know I always say that, and I know folks are shy, which you have the right to be shy. However, if you are feeling talkative or you do want to get involved, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A or the chat. This topic is one that really supports that sort of dialogue, and I know it's hard to talk about, so we're here within community, so don't be shy, but if you are, it's okay. And final piece of housekeeping announcements is closed captions. For those of you who need that extra accessibility, the closed captions have been enabled. If you are not seeing them or having some issue with them, again, I'm going to put my email address into the chat. If you need to reach out to me offline so I can get you hooked up, please feel free to do so. And with that being said, I'm going to end the housekeeping announcements and remind you of our wonderful dynamic duo that we have with us through this webinar series. We have Angela Downs, who is Professor of Practice and Assistant Director of Experiential Education at the University of North Texas College of Law. And we have Janet Fine, Consultant in Vicarious Trauma Response Initiative. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Janet and Angela, and also say again, thank you so much for this webinar series. I know that the folks listening in have been loving it as much as I have, and it's been a pleasure to work with you. So the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much, Alexis and Nicole and the entire team at Florida Legal Services. We are delighted to bring you part 3 of this wonderful talk and the wonderful experience that we are having talking to you about the importance of vicarious trauma. In our third segment today, we're going to be talking about organizational responsibility for addressing vicarious trauma. Your organization should actually be an active partner in your walk with vicarious trauma. So we're going to talk about things that your organizations can do to ensure that there's an organization that will uplift you and will be there to assist you as vicarious trauma takes place. So with that, let's talk about our learning objectives. All right, Janet.
Yeah. So today, given that there's been this sort of progression from the first session, the second session, third session, and then our last session next week, we really wanted to be able to sort of build from one to the next. And so for this training, our hope is that you'll be able to describe the rationale that organizations have for having sort of a duty and responsibility for addressing vicarious trauma at the workplace, within work time, and to discuss the ways in which we talked previously about the impact on our individual selves, both personally and professionally, but to discuss the organizational impact of vicarious trauma and how we can start to wrap our heads around a framework for building a healthy vicarious trauma-informed organization. We were going to do, I think in the to kick it off, I know that some of you have been here throughout and some of you may be joining anew, as Alexis said. So we wanted to do a little bit of a quick recap, though you'd have the opportunity to view the whole recording, but do a quick recap about what we sort of spoke about. That again is a building block to what we're talking about today. So I think this is a depiction of sort of a comprehensive view of vicarious trauma. And when we think about vicarious trauma, we know that the work that we do day in and day out is with a trauma-informed lens because of the nature of the work that we do and the kinds of lived experiences that clients have, et cetera. So vicarious trauma really needs to be viewed within that context. And so in terms of kind of having this bigger picture around vicarious trauma is the notion that there are both the inevitable experience that people have in this work, which by virtue of the day in and day out and the cumulative nature of the work that we do and the exposure to trauma, that we will inevitably have some kind of change in worldview, that we will view the world perhaps differently than we did before. Or if we thought the world was essentially a safe place, we might start to see that, in fact, there's a large slice of life, given our professional perspective, that the world is not safe or not just or not equitable, et cetera. So inevitably, people experience some measure of a change in worldview. There's some common elements of that across people, but also that may be very unique and individual. And then in terms of the spectrum of responses, on the left-hand side under spectrum of responses is really terminology that reflects the fact that there are, given the inevitability of the impact of our exposure to vicarious trauma, that there are some potential negative consequences from that. And that was part of what we've been talking about too, is the ways in which we are impacted negatively. And then there are ways in which we can learn, despite those experiences, that we can learn to manage. And that's really what our hope is, I think, overall for this series, is to think about both individually and organizationally ways to manage the impact and the effects of vicarious trauma. And then on the right-hand side of this diagram, under spectrum of responses, are terms that have kind of emerged to reflect the fact, sort of a little bit of a balance, reflect the fact that there's a lot of, we do this work because there's a lot of positive that we gain from it. And that while we might bear witness to the pain and suffering and fear and trauma that clients experience, we may also get the benefit of seeing where our contributions or our interventions or our support provides us with a measure of satisfaction, that we're able to bear witness to some degree to paths to healing and justice, or to the resilience that's demonstrated by the clients that we serve. So it's always important to kind of hold both of those as we think about the impact of our work-related trauma exposure.
And I like that it's broken down, that it's really kind of an ever-shifting dichotomy of things that are happening. You might one point feeling neutral, and then one point feeling very, very have that compassion fatigue, but then you can work your way to resilience. And so that's kind of where we really want you to, that's where we want you to end up, is really figuring out resilience. All right, so let's talk about contemplating effects. Janet, we've got physical, emotional, behavior, spiritual, cognitive. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so we took a look last time at the various ways across these different domains that we are, that there are some common effects that people have described about the impact of vicarious trauma. And they're not unlike what we might describe to clients who have experienced direct trauma. They're not unlike what we expect to see in response to crisis or trauma. The ways in which we might experience physical ailments, or have sleeplessness, or overeat, or have insomnia, or have physical pain and somatic responses. And then emotional, we may experience depression or numbness, or hopelessness or things of that nature. And behaviorally, we might really start to become more isolated from people around us. We might withdraw behaviorally. Or we might do things to kind of self-soothe, and sometimes those are ways that are potentially unhealthy. And I know Angela talked quite a bit about the ways in which in the legal arena, sometimes there are some maladaptive responses in that regard through over drinking or et cetera. Spiritually, sometimes people either cling more to their faith or to some kind of spiritual practice, and other times people feel like, given this slice of life or a change in worldview, we may feel like if there was sort of a supreme being, where is that supreme being in the face of all this trauma? So sometimes that there can be an impact in that way. Cognitively, and that relates also to, on the professional side of things, social relational performance is where, and morale, there may be ways in which our attention span gets impacted, or our processing or our decision-making processes are impacted. Our ability to coordinate and collaborate with colleagues. And likewise, in terms of morale, that hopelessness or helplessness may show up there. So, and there may be others that I'm missing, Angela,
what I'm thinking as another example, as we look at cognitive, there is, I don't know if this is a new phenomenon or not, but there is some emerging research on decision fatigue. That, there comes a time when you are the person that is making decisions all the time on a job and your family, that you are almost paralyzed and unable to make decisions. So that's that's another effect that can really show itself as you're, grappling with vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And a lot of times those interpersonal relationships, those things will break down because if you're giving so much of yourself in a work environment, sometimes it's very difficult to do in your personal life. So these are, again, things for you to think about. And what I think is also really important for you to take away is that there are different ways that this can show up and, and show itself as to something that you might need to take a harder look at as things are unfolding.
Yeah, and I would say that while there might be things that feel like they fall into more of a personal category and a professional category, they're very much inextricably linked.
Yeah.
So interpersonal people might feel like personally they're social isolating, but on the interpersonal, aspect at work, what you said made me think about how much effort it takes to collaborate. So even though we know in theory collaboration is an important strategy for delivering high quality services and understanding that we need each other to be able to, address all of the needs that our clients may have. But when we're reduced in our levels of energy, that's where conflict may come up. It's where it's easier to do things by myself than to collaborate. And so that can kind of get in the way of good, healthy practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're reminding you again, you can't pour from an empty cup. You've really got to take care of yourself. And then these are some reflections on self-care, reminding you again, who do you seek support from? The importance of really having that village around you, be it faith, be it friends, colleagues, but who are the people that you can reach out to that can provide you assistance, that can provide you just a listening ear when you need that. And what are some self-care strategies that you currently use to decompress? Is it taking a walk? Is it walking your dog? Is it going out in nature? What are these things? You've really got to identify some things and do them on a consistent basis so that they become part of what you're part of your just daily living. And it's something that you're not even thinking about, but you're almost automatically incorporating them into your day. And do you talk openly with supervisors and peers about your own and shared experiences of vicarious trauma? The more we talk about this, the more you realize that you are not alone with this. Um, Anyone that does this work is going through something similar. Um, and so there's a need to really talk about what's happening, not to hide it, not to have an embarrassment about what's happening, but really to bring it to the forefront, so that everyone can know what's happening and everyone can work toward a solution. And do you share those self-care strategies? Do you also share self-care strategies that work for you? Is there something that's working for you? And once those lines of communication are open, um, are you talking about what you do to take care of yourself with others? Sometimes something that you have identified for yourself can be very, very helpful for someone that's similarly situated. All right. Did I forget anything, Janet?
I don't think so. I think this
Okay.
partly is, again, a building block toward
Yeah.
talking about how we use each other in our work day, in our workplace, to integrate this into our common conversation, and to normalize it and to be able to be in community around it.
Okay. Well, this next slide is our poll. And I'm going to ask Alexis to please launch the poll.
My pleasure. 1 second.
And as we've said, the importance of really identifying what you can do to to take care of yourself, for that self-care.
And while people are answering the poll question, I'll say I put it in the chat, but you bringing up that decision fatigue, I have experienced that,
Yeah.
all of my career. And it's absolutely this feeling of not wanting to make decisions outside of work anymore. And because I'm doing it on behalf of other people, it's making it difficult for me. And I was thinking how that kind of almost fuels the cycle of feeling bad about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So,
Yeah.
but once you recognize it, you can do some things to really get in front of it and
Right.
figure out what is it that's kind of triggering that for you.
Right. And reminding yourself it's not because
Yeah.
I'm incapable of making decisions.
Oh
It's
my
because
gosh.
I'm tired of making
You're
decisions.
tired. You've
Take a break.
made a million decisions for a million different folks. And having to figure out maybe what's for dinner could be the last straw.
Absolutely. And so I
Okay.
see we have 33 responses. We have
Yes. Oh,
52 folks
great.
on here. So you let
All
me know
right.
if you want me to
All right,
call it.
let's give folks just a few more seconds.
And I see that Nicole mentioned, in relation to the questions that Angela was just posing to people as sort of self-care reflections, said our survivor advocacy group meets every other week to talk about shared experiences and brainstorm self-care strategies and help us build resilience and longevity in a tough field. That's exactly what we're talking about, and is a real protective factor for people to know there's a place to bring this and that it's okay to talk about it, and that you can in fact share and learn from each other about various strategies to put in your toolbox, so to speak.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's go ahead and stop the poll with 73% that have participated. And I am very pleased to see that getting rest is actually at 66%. I'm very excited about that. We know that the importance of getting rest and getting sleep so that your body, your mind can rest and can rejuvenated. So this is really great. Taking breaks throughout the day at 53% looks like a close second. Exercising. So it looks as though folks have identified some things that can really help them as they are looking to manage and to be involved with self-care. Anything that surprised you, Janet, about the numbers?
No, I mean, it seems like there's some reflection about things that people do outside of work, but also that notion about 53% taking breaks throughout the day is
Yeah.
building some of those strategies, even though that may seem sort of an easy, simple, strategy. Building that in throughout the workday is a significant additional piece of this overall response.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's keep moving forward kind of with this in mind. All right, this is that well-being toolkit. So as we were thinking and talking last week, the toolkit that was developed by the American Bar Association had some different strategies and processes for lawyers, but it's applicable for any allied professional to really thrive in each dimension of their life. And so they've identified emotional, really figuring out the importance of developing the ability to identify and manage your emotions to support mental health, occupational, cultivating personal satisfaction, growth, and enrichment at work. And financial stability, of course, is a very big part of that. Intellectual, ensuring that you are continually being challenged, that you are, most of us in this profession are lifelong learners. So ensuring that that part of us is being fed intellectually, spiritual, making sure that we have meaningfulness and purposefulness in all aspects of our life. And again, mirroring what we just saw in the poll with physical, getting out there, being active, regular physical activity, proper diet and exercise, sleep, all of the things that we've talked about, things that sound so simple, but we find that are often very, very challenging to maintain in the profession. And then again, developing that sense of connection. We talked about isolation and how we are, although we're more connected through social media and through devices, phones, tablets, etc., we are still disconnected because what we're putting forth is not our real life. It's a more curated reflection of what we're experiencing. But having those real connections and even reflecting back to the Surgeon General's report that really focused on loneliness and really ensuring that there were communities that were being connected and that there were opportunities for people to feel connected in their communities. So there's a lot of great information that's really supporting what we're saying, and really the importance of really going and identifying with these different areas and really making some real efforts to ensure that you're healthy and safe.
Yeah, and I think when you were saying that, I think the part about developing a sense of connection, part of what that speaks to also to me is the notion that in these complex areas of work that we're in, recognizing that we're one piece of a larger puzzle, so that we don't have to, sort of have the expectation that we somehow can solve everything, or that we need to rely on others in order to put together this network of support for clients. So I think that comes with developing that sense of connection with others.
Okay. All right. Well, that's fantastic. Okay. So let's talk about building resilience, Janet.
Yeah, so resilience, and we use this word quite a bit, and certainly in the context of our work-related trauma exposure, that we need to build and resilience. We need to sustain ourselves in this work, and I think part of what's helpful, and certainly as I've read a little bit more about the notion of resilience, is sometimes we define it as sort of bouncing back from some adversity or whatever. And it is that, but it's not simply about bouncing back. It's about change. If you just bounce back to exactly like you were before, then you haven't really sort of learned or have grown, or et cetera. And resilience to me seemed more dynamic and about learning and about growing. There's this program, the Resilience and Positive Psychology Training Program at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's the last quote on there comes from the director of that program. And she said that having the ability to bounce back from adversity and the ability to grow from challenges, it's a skill set we all have the ability to build and grow. So it isn't something that we either have or we don't have. And we want to be clear that resiliency doesn't replace the need for systemic change. So that as we're building our own resilience, that we're also continuing to couple that with our efforts at activism, that resilience and activism go hand in hand, and that's part of the change we hope to see. So bouncing back, yes, but also learning and growing and contributing to change, both for ourselves, but also for our agencies and our systems.
Yeah, and it seems as though a lot of times when we have adversity, when we have situations where we, um, in our minds, we fail, a lot of times that's really when the learning begins. That's when the real change begins. If you look back on those opportunities where things have happened, they have been things that have changed aspects of your life for the better. Maybe not during that time period that you were going through it, but it's that ability to build resilience is just critically important, really important. So I'm excited that we're talking about resilience, and kind of hand in hand with resilience is grit. Angela Duckworth wrote, the kind of the groundbreaking book on grit, and really talks about grit is passion and perseverance for long-term and meaningful goals. And I know her TED Talk has been viewed over 1 million times, but it's about really having direction and commitment. When you can really commit to a task that might be difficult or boring. And it's also perseverance. It means to stick with it, to continue working hard, even after experiencing difficulty or failure. So with that, there's that connection with resiliency. And if we look at some of the trends for skills that they're saying workers in the future are going to need, grit is one of those things that has been identified as something that you need. And particularly if you are going to do this work, there has to be a certain amount of grit that you have, because we're all in this for the long haul. Janet says that we've got to be the change that we want to see. And part of that is having perseverance. Part of that, is really having the ability to look long range into work, and to think long range about what you're doing. So, we wanted to talk to you about this because we think it could add value to what we're looking to do with self-care. It's really a personality trait possessed by individuals who demonstrate passion and perseverance. And the research has found that possess grit are really able to self-regulate and postpone their positive need for reinforcement while working diligently on a task. And that last part becomes important because we have, as a society, we've transitioned to wanting things. There's the expectation of instant gratification. And if you look at that just on the most simple level with what our expectation is for social media, we're looking for clicks, we're looking for views. But oftentimes, the research tells us that there's that really having that stick-to-itiveness, having that ability to really delay gratification, really is an indicator of someone that has grit, and someone that can really get in there and really persevere when things get challenging. So we'll just encourage you to think about that, and think about it as a strategy, again, to put in your tool bag.
Yeah, and I see that Amanda put in the chat, which is another great way of thinking about this, is she's she says, personally, I hold on to challenges refine us, but do not define us.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Oh,
which
that's
is,
wonderful.
yeah, is really, really awesome, very meaningful.
Yeah. And people talk about, we've heard kind of this grit is kind of as a kind of a pop psychology type of thing. It's very in vogue to talk about grit. But on the practical level, you've got to think, there's some things that have been broken down that says that you can manage your distractions, but not so much that you're hyper focused, but really working toward the goal, and ensuring that you're on the track to meet those goals in a systematic and clear way. And then also, um, confronting your fears of failure. It's a very real fear. If you're a trial lawyer, it can be scary to get up and put forth a case. You put a lot of effort into it. But at some point, you've got to realize that everybody fails, encounters some level of challenge, and that sometimes it's valuable for you, if you're willing to experience some amount of failure in order to achieve. So, as I've said, sometimes those greatest disappointments are the things that can bring us our greatest rewards. So, really letting go of that fear of failure can be, not only freeing, but it can really open you up to what you didn't even know was possible. And then generating your own early rewards. We've talked with this conversation about grit is kind of unfolding about, ensuring that, we are looking at the long range goal, but along the way, making sure that you're incorporating some small rewards for you so that when you get to the big reward, it hasn't been so incredibly long for you. But and that also comes to, if you've got something that's a long range project or something that you're working on, breaking it down into small, very manageable pieces, is something that can be really, really helpful for you. So that's a little bit about grit.
Yeah, and that makes me think too, Angela, about, because I love this piece about grit. It makes me think about the notion of being able to acknowledge successes, even if they seem like small in the face of what your overall goal is. I think we spend so much time talking about whatever the problems and the challenges are and how to address them and how to strategize around them and problem solve and all of that. And we probably spend less time talking about our achievements and our successes, and
Yeah.
big and small. So I think that's that great counterbalance.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So self-care, which we've talked about now for a bit, for the first two sessions, and then sort of as part of the building block for today. There's no question that self-care and individual responsibility for our own work-related trauma exposure and its impact and self-care strategies, et cetera, all of that is absolutely essential. But it really, over the past number of years, we've really come to better understand that that's not the full picture. That I think historically, people working in these various professions, exposed to trauma on a regular basis, the expectation was that, yes, self-care is important. And yes, we understand we're impacted by the work that we do, but sort of do it on your own, have your own self-care strategies and do it on your own time. And for some people, that really felt like an extra burden in all honesty. So I think the notion about everybody sort of developing their own awareness and their own recognition of how they're impacted personally, professionally, as individuals, and developing self-care strategy is absolutely essential. But as we've come to recognize and sort of bring to the fore is this notion that organizations recognize that staff need to be aware of, first and foremost, be aware of this issue of work-related trauma exposure, that it's real, that it's inevitable, and about the potential negative effects of it and how to address it. So there's sort of some awareness raising, knowledge building, et cetera, around this issue from the context of organizations, in the context of organizations, and that action needs to be taken at an organizational level, and that self-care alone simply isn't enough. Organizations need to promote support for staff in various ways during work hours is kind of the underscore there. And so, in fact, even having this series of webinars is essential to kind of meeting these foundational pieces of becoming sort of more vicarious trauma aware, vicarious trauma informed, and then to individually and collectively develop strategies to address it.
Absolutely. And I think, Janet, if we think about this, we spend the majority of our time at work. And certainly, in order to have healthy organizations and have healthy folks working in organizations, there's got to be some kind of organizational conversation because we spend the majority of our time at work. I mean, honestly, I mean, if we just, did a quick poll, we would know that we are spending, even if we're not physically in the office, we're on Zoom calls, we're doing work, we're having interactions, we're meeting with clients, and we're working for the majority of our time. And so it's critical for organizations to have that structure, in order to have a healthy workspace.
So this is really just to kind of now sort of shift into the whole notion about organizational impact and understanding how the exposure to the trauma of others in our work lives impact organizations as a whole, impact us as individuals within the organizations, but organizations as a whole. And it's interesting that in other occupations, there have in fact been legislative efforts and regulations, et cetera, to create occupational safety and health. And so I think the movement in our various fields of practice toward organizational health and safety is physical safety, emotional safety, psychological safety, et cetera, is really critical. So not unlike sort of the OSHA standards or regulations that exist for other professions or other occupations, this is sort of what we're needing to do in the kinds of agencies and services, professional services that we provide. So what can happen when organizations don't address vicarious trauma? We talked on the individual level about some of the negative consequences of unaddressed vicarious trauma across a number of different domains. But research suggests that, and then the next slide kind of has sort of our depiction of what some of the consequences are for organizations. So, and this may not be new news to many of you, but the notion about lost productivity, we talked about the professional impact, and poor organizational health and staff turnover. We talked about some of the ways in which the decision fatigue, for example, that Angela raised, or the notion about sort of our motivation or performance being impacted, and that altogether kind of contributing to some measure of poor organizational health, or also decreasing morale and decreasing productivity, that cohesion that comes from social interaction, or as we spoke about already, the notion that it may impact our ability to communicate, coordinate, and collaborate with our colleagues. And then certainly staff turnover in these jobs. Sometimes there's some legitimate reason why people decide to move on in their careers. I know certainly in victim advocacy, I know that salaries may sometimes be an issue. Some real life, realistic, practical issues may dictate what people decide to do and how long they are in a particular job. But part of what having this sort of organizational responsibility is about, or understanding this framework of organizational impact, is to try and recognize, is vicarious trauma at play that is impeding staff's ability to be resilient and ensure longevity, particularly for people who are really interested in wanting to stay in the work for the long haul, but somehow unaddressed vicarious trauma is making it difficult for them to do so. So staff turnover, is sometimes the natural, nature of the beast in some agencies and organizations. But recognizing that vicarious trauma may play a role in that, if unaddressed, is important. And then ultimately, all of these types of organizational impacts can certainly lead to, as we've already talked about quite a bit, diminished health and well-being for the individuals, staff people, staff, volunteers, interns, et cetera. And also then ultimately it has an impact on the quality of services and quality of care that's being delivered to the clients, the ultimate beneficiaries of the work that we do. And I imagine that there are some of these things that you may recognize in your own experience, either previous employment opportunities or current ones. Angela, you may well have seen some of these show up in legal arenas, or so these are some common impacts organizationally that happen with unaddressed vicarious trauma.
Absolutely. Definitely morale. Morale is one I think that folks see, and then staff turnover, where people, just say, I can't do it anymore. Either financially, time, they're so depleted that for their own health, they decide that they need to do something else.
Yeah,
So,
and I think with the staff turnover too, part of what's sort of depicted here is also that the amount of time and resource drain that goes into onboarding new people, the whole interviewing and hiring process and training and orientation, all of that. While that's all happening, then some of those responsibilities are offloaded to other staff, and so they're sort of all somehow interconnected, because that may certainly lead to decreased morale as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's talk about trauma-informed approach framework. What you can do to be trauma-informed in your approach here. So we've got the 3 E's of trauma: event, a series of events or set of circumstances, experienced, physically, emotionally harmful or threatening, and then those lasting effects is what we've talked about, that affects your functioning and well-being. They're adverse and they're long-lasting. How many times have you had a case or a victim that you've worked with and it's been years ago and you still think about that case, that victim, that person that you've worked with so many years down the line? So there's definitely some long-lasting effects. So Janet, as we are looking kind of at the 3 E's of trauma, how are we navigating this space?
Well, and I think that, again, with the lens of our output to be around helping people who have directly experienced trauma, recognizing these 3 E's that Angela just described is important in terms of thinking about vicarious trauma. So again, understanding that a trauma-informed approach has to incorporate a vicarious trauma-informed approach. So unless we address that, we are going to compromise our ability to address these 3 E's of trauma for the clients, and we'll be falling victim to the things on the prior slide that we were talking about in terms of how we're impacted.
Absolutely. So that moves us to the 4 R's of trauma-informed approach: realizing the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. So really recognizing that this is happening, but then figuring out, what can I do to get myself back on track? Recognizing the signs and symptoms in clients, families, and staff, and others involved in the system. So that's really that community aspect that we were asking you to really recognize in the work. And then responding to fully integrated knowledge about trauma and to policies, procedures, and practices. I think this really becomes critical, because it's not, particularly for organizations, because it's not if this is going to happen to your organization, it's when. And I know one thing that we want to encourage you to do is to get ahead of it. What are your policies going to look like? How are you going to handle it if somebody needs to take some time to get some assistance? What is the caseload shift going to look like? What is the integration back if the person decides that they're going to come back into the organization? What is all that stuff going to look like? You really need to spend some time laying that out and really having some clear policies and procedures so that the person that's getting the help can be successful in their journey and the organization can move forward to continue to do the great work that they're doing. Also seeking to actively resist re-traumatization, really putting those stopgap measures in place so that we're not being re-traumatized, really taking that and being really active and very vocal that we want organizations to be healthy. We want folks that are working there to have the tools that they need, not only to be successful, but to be healthy. And then,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no,
Sorry,
and I
Janet.
was just going to say, in this, it's really helpful to see that sort of real integration here, like recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients and families. That's our output. That's our ability to sort of reach out and recognize what we're seeing in terms of clients' lived experiences. But it also recognizing those signs and symptoms about staff and others
Oh,
in our system,
absolutely.
like our colleagues within the system.
Okay, and lastly, the 6 principles of the trauma-informed approach. Safety. We want to have an environment that's safe. We want trust and transparency. Folks are not going to be transparent with an organization if they do not feel that there's some level of confidentiality and trust, that what they share will not be reported to everyone in the organization, but it will be held in confidence. You've got to have that peer support. What does that look like? And how are you best able as an organization to provide supportive measures for folks in your organization? There's got to be that collaboration and that mutuality. And you've got to have a level of empowerment. You've got to provide people with a voice and a choice in order to have an environment where people feel as though they really have a stake in the success and their health in what they're providing to the organization. And then also making sure that there's cultural, historical, and gender issues, making sure that it's not just a one way of looking at the issue, but really integrating cultural responsiveness, looking at what are the things that might be helpful, looking at the issue from different genders, and also is there a historical context with respect to perhaps a certain segment of the population maybe not really embracing mental health issues that needs to be addressed. So just being sensitive with that and in making sure that's part of what's being integrated into the court. I'm sorry, into the organization. I apologize.
And the court.
Yeah, in the court as well. All right.
Okay. And I say, Julie, you put a very important question in the chat, and I think we're going to talk some about this both this time and the next session about, sort of the responsibility of leadership. And you're raising the issue about when members of leadership fail to adequately address workplace matters and how that sort of unfairly piles more work or more distress on those employees that are looking to do their job better and all of that. So we're hoping to talk a bit more about that in the context of this sort of organizational framework of response to vicarious trauma. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah, it's a great question. But really, here's some of the rationale for taking action. This is why employers and organizations really need to embrace this. We know that people are the most valuable resource that an organization has. And really discussing the negative impacts of the work without worry of stigma can really help the organization to grow and can create a healthier environment for the employees and for those that are doing the work. and also getting back to what we've been talking about with resilience and grit, recognizing and promoting the positive impact of our work really helps us to flex that resilient muscle, and it really helps us with grit. So these are both great things to ensure that we have a healthy work environment.
Okay. So, and I think this is a good segue from Julie's comment, both question and comment. But I had the privilege of working on this multi-year project, multi-agency, multi-discipline project that was funded by the Federal Office for Victims of Crime, called the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit Project, that developed an online resource for organizational response to vicarious trauma, largely focused initially on 3 categories of first responders and victim service providers of all kinds. The first responders being the law enforcement, fire services, and emergency medical services. But you can see on this slide that the team of both local and national, Northeastern University in Boston was the principal investigator for this project. And there were some local partners and then all these national partners that really helped to develop this online toolkit or repository of resources for agencies and organizations looking to address vicarious trauma. So the next slide, I think, the toolkit, because there wasn't a lot of research precedent for what is evidence-based in terms of organizational vicarious trauma response, there was a lot of effort that went into gathering research and resources from the field around, as Angela just mentioned, healthy workplaces. So sort of from the organizational psychology research, et cetera, really helped to refine what we were going to ultimately include in this online toolkit. So after many efforts nationally, and through surveys of the field and through gathering resources from the field, and having some pilot sites that were interdisciplinary in nature around the country that sort of talked about the organizational strategies that they used or policies and procedures that they had in place or things that they were looking to develop. There are now over about 500 resources within this online toolkit that include these things: policies, procedures, practices, and programs that agencies and organizations have utilized or have already in place, research literature, all of which went through a pretty rigorous review and vetting process to know what was going to be most useful and meaningful for the various fields that it was targeted at. Various training videos or podcasts, websites, things that could be helpful in terms of raising awareness about the issue of vicarious trauma. And then even with that sort of exhaustive effort or close to exhaustive effort to sort of gather sort of the best or promising practices that were out in the field, there were identified gaps, that there were some tools that were missing. There were some tools that they wished they had found or that they wished existed, et cetera. And so this interdisciplinary group of people and practitioners really went about trying to fill some of those gaps. And so some of that we'll talk about next time. Like there's an organizational assessment tool that was created based on some pillars of a healthy work environment, a healthy workplace, that was developed. There were also tools to your point, Julie, about leadership, about sort of making the business case for leadership and talking points for leaders to be able to really talk with the staff in their agencies and organizations or boards, et cetera, about why this needed to be a priority. So there were there's also some HR guidelines in there. There's some guidelines around peer support and supervision, vicarious trauma-informed supervision. And so a variety of different new tools that were developed to fill some of the gaps that were identified in the field. So just moving into talking about the framework that was used both for the toolkit, so it's the way in which you can navigate the toolkit, but also really just speaks to much of what we've started talking about in terms of organizational impact and response, and this notion about building a vicarious trauma-informed organization. That's part of being trauma-informed. And so the framework that is used is sort of these 5 pillars of a healthy organization: leadership and mission. That's where the issue that you raised, Julie, squarely fits into that category. Management and supervision, employee empowerment and work environment, training and professional development, and staff health and wellness. And that a variety of different types of strategies and responses, and how to assess what you're currently doing and where your gaps might be, fall into these various categories. And so these are, this isn't sort of an exhaustive list, but these sort of give you an idea of kind of what defines each of these categories or pillars. So under leadership and mission, it's about maintaining a clear vision that responding to the work-related trauma exposure of staff is part of that mission. Modeling and promoting open and respectful communication and work-life balance. So being able to, as leaders, model awareness and understanding and response. Integrating strategies about vicarious trauma into workplace values and policies and protocols. And I think that's some of what you're referencing needs to happen. And then in terms of management and supervision, going back one, Angela, is really about, at that other level, about being able to kind of foster this sense of support and collaboration and peer support, and to promote vicarious trauma-informed practices, and to seek staff out, to be proactive about talking with staff, making it, normalizing the notion about talking about difficult cases or difficult experiences, and integrating discussion of vicarious trauma into supervision meetings, individual supervision meetings or staff meetings, and having it be integrated into performance evaluations for there to be some give and take about what's helpful and what hasn't been as helpful, or what could be more helpful. So with employee empowerment and work environment, and we spoke some, or when Angela was going through the framework for trauma-informed approach, the notion about employee empowerment, empowering staff to be contributing to the development of policies and protocols, and to be able to have some discourse about what's helpful and what's less helpful, or what could be more helpful, and encouraging that mutual feedback and collaboration. And also, Angela, you mentioned the notion about diversifying job tasks, that 100% of your time and effort and energy during the workday need not be focused on direct exposure to those who have experienced trauma. So what other types of responsibilities could perhaps be built in to help alleviate some of that work-related trauma exposure? And again, training and professional development, really integrating the notion and understanding about vicarious trauma as inevitable, and discussing it during a hiring process, and including it in orientation and training and in continuing education, and ensuring that people have the kind of resources that they need to do their jobs and do them well. And then the final pillar is really about staff health and wellness, which sometimes people have said, well, we don't have the resources to or the space to build a gym, or to build a yoga studio, or to do all these other, or to pay for people's gym memberships or things of that nature. But there are lots of other things that people can do. And I think you mentioned some of them earlier, Angela, even with the poll about taking breaks during the day, maybe taking walks together, getting outside, some fresh air, being in nature, etc. Things that are doable and that certainly contribute to staff health and wellness. So just, you're in good company as we think about how agencies and organizations have begun to think about sort of becoming vicarious trauma informed in a variety of different ways. So there's been an increase in awareness about organizational responsibility for vicarious trauma, increased requests for training and technical assistance like this training series. And then this list is some examples of agency or organization initiatives around building vicarious trauma response. Domestic and sexual violence coalitions have sought, the kind of training and technical assistance necessary to develop vicarious trauma plans. Local and statewide legal services agencies, an entire state family court system underwent a series of trainings and organizational development strategies, strategy development. A National Crime Victim Bar Association, Angela and I were both involved in providing some training for National Crime Victim Bar Association. Other interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary team agencies, programs that may include legal services, certainly educational institutions, where issues around Title IX in response to those who are experiencing discrimination or sexual assault on campuses or in private schools, et cetera. And then most recently, the multi-year federally funded project that is coming to a conclusion, but that really sort of helped us think beyond individual and beyond organizational, to think that in the effort to be part of a community, the notion of bringing together different agencies within a community to think collaboratively and perhaps doing training collaboratively around vicarious trauma and develop some interagency strategies to address vicarious trauma. So helping to build those partnerships and strengthen those interagency partnerships at the same time that looking to sort of mitigate some of the potential negative consequences of vicarious trauma. So that's just to give you a sense of kind of the evolution of practice around this issue of vicarious trauma, individual, organizational, and community.
And I think what's great is we know it's a continuum. We know that we have had building blocks, and we're recognizing the importance of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, and we're still building. But I think it's wonderful that we have tools at our fingertips that can help guide us as we are working in these different spaces. So during our next session, we're going to talk about building a vicarious trauma-informed organization. Really excited to talk with you and more in depth about some of the tools that are available to you. And at this time, if there are any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you.
And so I think you were able to address everything that came up in the chat, and thank you so much for doing that. It's so nice to have that dialogue as we're, going through a presentation and also being part of in the virtual world. Folks, please, drop some questions in if you have them. I'll take up some airspace in the meantime with a question that came to my mind. A lot of the organizations, legal aid organizations especially, there's a tension, and I don't even know if tension is really the right word, but you have your funders and you have deliverables and you have grants, right? Grants that require certain responses that you numbers you have to hit and things like that. That sort of puts on, the leadership pressure to put pressure down on people who are on the front lines, and sort of drive this bus of like, we understand you need a break, but we have deliverables we have to meet, right? And maybe the leadership doesn't want to operate that way, but they have someone they're answering to that's out of their control. And I bring that up to say, what are your thoughts on that? And what are some things that folks in that situation can do to sort of alleviate that storm, that cycle, that cyclone that's going on based on that sort of tension of funders?
That's a good question.
It's a very good question. I'm like, how much time do we have? But a lot of it, Alexis, is communication. I mean, we all know the end goal, and the reality is we've got to have funding in order to do this work. But you have to have a communication piece, and you've really got to have a team in place to ensure that it's not just one person who is carrying the entire burden. And so I know that's one thing that we've talked about is, having that diversity of who's going to do what and who can you pass and kind of share the wealth with some of these things, because it can be a very, very heavy lift.
Yeah, and that employee empowerment piece that, sometimes it may not be within somebody's sort of immediate scope of work, but they may have something to lend that sort of helps at the same time, helps both processes, the impact on themselves, like the opportunity to sort of diversify tasks, but also contributes to the overall effort that is so burdensome.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. And something else that you were saying that made me think of, my days when I was in the trenches as a PD was sort of what you touched on making a safe space for, it to be accepted, to be overwhelmed. And they're not saying accepting being overwhelmed, but that it's comfortable to talk about. So when I was a young PD, you didn't want to go in and say, I'm overwhelmed. I have so many cases. I don't know what to do. I'm stressed out. I'm having vicarious trauma. Not that I even knew what vicarious trauma was then. But it was a space where you felt uber competitive and you couldn't show what was perceived as, I don't want to use the word weakness, but perceived in that way. Not that it was.
As a weakness. I mean, it's a weakness. And people did perceive that, Alexis. I was there as a prosecutor and you had to appear a certain way.
Right.
And so, but it's, it says healthy conversations, knowing that if we're going to invest and be successful in what we do and invest in our employees, we have to have safe spaces for people to really share authentically what's happening to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I see that Nicole mentioned, which it looks like there's a second. Do I hear a third? Maybe pushing funders for more admin support and grant requests. I do think, it's interesting to think about motion passes. It's interesting to think about the fact that some Department of Justice agencies have, obviously the Federal Office of Victims of Crime has dedicated a fair amount of funding over the last many years to this issue of organizational response for a variety of different types of service providers and different professions to address this issue with an understanding that there's a trickle to delivering high quality services consistently and over the long haul to the clients that we serve, individually and collectively serve. So the notion that funding should sort of include this, sort of reflect that growing understanding and the fact that we are serving our clients well by serving ourselves. So, I see the smiley face that you put after that, Nicole, but it's something that I think the funders should certainly be thinking about that. And that's another area of, perhaps growth for training and technical assistance, but it should be well integrated there also.
Amazing. Absolutely true. I support any training that you can provide them that trickles back down to us.
Would love to provide it.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to invite those that are still with us to please complete the evaluation QR code or go to the link. That just helps us really gauge if this talk resonated with you and things that we can do to improve our time, because we really want to ensure that we're providing content that really makes sense for you. So please go use that QR code. And also, if you need to reach us, here's our contact information. It has been a pleasure being with you, and we look forward to our last segment with you next week.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. Have a fantastic rest of your week. Great weekend, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.